Without further ado, because we've got a lot of content, we'll go ahead and jump into the program, and I'll have an opportunity to close at the end. I'm going to turn the microphone back to Mike Russes.
Thank you, Director. And just as a quick review of our agenda today, we'll get right into the agenda with a presentation from Matthew Belk, Senior Forecaster from the National Weather Service, Boston, who will cover the Southern New England tropical cyclone climatology and threats. Then we'll introduce Dan Brown, Senior Hurricane Specialist at the National Hurricane Center, who will discuss recent changes to the National Hurricane Center products and their success during the 2017 hurricane season. Paul Morey will then jump into hurricane evacuation decision-making in the face of uncertainty. Paul is a Hurricane Program Manager at FEMA Region 1. And in closing, Director Schwartz will discuss MEMA's preparedness activities and updates at the conclusion of our webinar. Without further ado, I'd like to now introduce Matthew Belk of the National Weather Service. Matthew.
Good morning, everyone. So what I'd like to do today is briefly review the climatology of tropical cyclones in southern New England. We do have a little different flavor of these systems than the Gulf Coast and the southeast U.S. We'll also talk about the hazards and potential impacts that you should factor into your planning when dealing with these kinds of systems. So when is hurricane season? So the official Atlantic season runs from June 1 through November 30. But as you see from the graph here, our season is really mid-July, August, September into October. It has been as early as May 12th and could be as late as mid-November. A lot of that has to do with the temperature of our water, which really doesn't peak until after Independence Day. So let's take a quick look at the climatology. So this is a return period in years for a Category 1 hurricane. And if you look at Nantucket, you'll see the number 13. And what that really means is it's on average once every 13 years, there's a Category 1 hurricane that passes within 58 miles of Nantucket. So if you do some quick math, and I've done it for you already, it's generally about 5 to 7 Category 1 hurricanes in a given century. When we take a look at major hurricanes, which would be Category 3 or higher, you look at the return periods here, and you see that you're talking 58, 62 years, 50 years. So in general, you're looking at maybe 1 to 2 major hurricanes in a given century. So really where the concern is with this is these don't happen very frequently. We don't have a lot of experience with these. More importantly, the memory of the general populace is pretty short. We don't really understand or really remember what it's like to live through one of these systems. So this is a study that we conducted locally in 2017. We identified 167 tropical storms, hurricanes, and systems that were once tropical but are no longer, more like a nor'easter, since 1851. And what you'll see here is the yellow cross down by the Bahamas is the center. It's the mean position, and all the red crosses are individual storms. And the size of the circles represent uncertainty. So the larger the circles, the more uncertain we get. So one of the rules of thumbs for southern New England hurricanes is it's going to pass near or through the Bahamas, and the study kind of bore that out. So here we are 5 days before landfall of the eye, and there it is right there in the Bahamas. If we move a little bit closer, forward in time, David. Well, we'll hopefully get this to advance here. But if we advance this forward in time, we will see that the systems move along the Bahama chain towards the coast of Florida into a little triangle, say from Cape Hatteras down to the Bahamas, then into Florida there. So there it is, 72 hours by the northern Bahama chain. And you see that the circles have gotten a little bit smaller. So then we'll advance a little bit further on in time, and we should see it move much closer to the southeast U.S. coast. And then we have to run the gauntlet past the Outer Banks before the system will actually approach southern New England. And again, the circles are getting smaller, so we see that there's some uncertainty. So here we are at 24 hours. We're right by the Outer Banks. And this is, as I said, the gauntlet. If it runs over the Outer Banks or where North Carolina kind of sticks out in the mid-Atlantic, chances are the system's going to weaken before it gets to us. If, however, it manages to stay just offshore over the Gulf Stream and it accelerates fast enough, these are when we get our stronger hurricanes. And you'll kind of see that as we move on up the coast. It is taking a much narrower path, and you see everything just starts coming together before we actually get to a landfall position, which is out on average, out by Nantucket. But you see there's plenty that go as far west as New York, and there are others that stay offshore. So this is a little different view of that study. Everything's kind of plotted all in one spot, so you can see the individual storms, but the mean positions are the same. So if you would, please just take a quick look at the distance between the 0 and 6 hours at the upper end of the graphic before landfall, and then you look down in the Bahamas between 120 and 108, and the distance is actually, it looks by my eyeball ruler, a little bit larger distance in that last 6 hours than in the first 12 hours that we conducted in this study, and that's because of the acceleration. So an average system making landfall as a hurricane in southern New England is moving about 30-35 miles per hour. You need to factor that into your preparedness planning because these systems do tend to accelerate, and factor in that acceleration into your preparation because they tend not to move at a steady speed. When we looked at that previous graphic and you walk into your EOC in the morning, and this is the position of the hurricane, and if we were to go back and look, you'd say, oh, this is about 15, 17 hours from making landfall for the eye. So how long do you think it would be before the impacts are felt in Worcester, which is represented by the yellow square? If you take a quick look, it's already been happening for a couple of hours now. And the point I'm trying to make here is that a hurricane is not a point. We tend to focus on the eye. Where's the eye? Where's the storm located? But these things have a width. And that width is going to really, that's really when you want to be done with your preparations and preparedness actions. You don't want to get caught towards the tail end of your evacuation, say, or whatever outdoor work needs to be done before the tropical storm force winds arrive. So now we'll start talking about some of the hazards, and this is probably the most sneaky of all of the hazards that we would think of when we think about tropical systems, and that would be rip currents. These can happen more than 1,000 miles in advance of a tropical system, and it often catches people unaware of the risk because the weather's not bad. It could be perfectly sunny, and everybody wants to go to the beach. It's hot, it's humid. But because of this tropical system out in the Atlantic, you wind up with the risk of rip currents. And shallow beaches perpendicular to the swell motion coming from the storm are most at risk, which is basically the entire ocean-exposed south coast of Massachusetts. These are difficult to make decisions for because there's often an economic impact for closing a beach on an otherwise beautiful summer day. So this is, again, one of the sneaky hazards that we're trying to deal with. So when we look at the south coast of New England, it tends to be a shallow shelf. And what this is going to do is it's going to result in larger surges but lower wave heights for the south coast of Massachusetts. And then you get to a steep shelf, and this would be the east coast of Massachusetts. You tend to wind up with lower surges, but higher waves and more erosion. So that is one of the areas that we're going to try to address here. So the surge you see on the image on the left, the surge goes further inland, whereas on the right, on the east coast of Massachusetts, you wind up with a bit more beach erosion. We have tremendous potential for storm surges on south-facing bays, with a more significant surge occurring within 1 hour of landfall. Wave run-up can cause coastal flooding to begin as much as 6 hours before the eye comes ashore, and that's in spite of the storm's rapid acceleration. We have observed in the past storm surges of 12 to 15 feet, and then there's potential for 20-plus feet of inundation above ground level from a Category 3 storm at the head of Buzzards Bay if, unfortunately, a storm tracks in just the wrong way to make that happen. So this is the next version of Hurricane. So this might be a little bit different looking at the inundation potential. These are all above ground level. So this is kind of the maximum envelope of water that we would expect to see for a Category 1 storm generally moving in a northerly direction. So you see all along the coastline of Massachusetts, you're at least talking 5 to 6 feet of potential for inundation along the immediate coastline. And then you look up towards Buzzards Bay from, say, Marion through Mattapoisett, Wareham, Onset, Buzzards Bay, and even into portions of Bourne. For a Category 1 storm tracking just right, you're looking at 9 to 10 feet above ground level of inundation pretty easily. You could also look at, even over by Fall River, you see there's a backwater flooding going up the Taunton River, even as far inland as Bridgewater and Middleborough. So these are all sorts of things that we would need to be concerned about, particularly along the immediate coast. If we look at the east coast of Massachusetts, you see you still have potential for a 5 to 7 foot inundation above ground level, but this would have to take more of a sandy track where the system would kind of parallel Massachusetts and then take a sharp left turn and come almost due left. There's also backwater flooding on the Merrimack, the Mystic, and the Charles Rivers that we would need to be concerned about. The Charles River could be mitigated to some extent simply by closing the Charles River Dam. But we'll take a closer zoomed-in look for the city of Boston, and you can see that even up the Charles River Dam, if for whatever reason it couldn't be closed, there's potential for 8 to 9 feet of flooding up the Charles River. But even in the city of Boston itself, you're looking at a good portion of the city being inundated with a significant amount of water. So we already talked about the rapid forward motion at landfall. It's generally 30, 35 miles per hour. The Great New England Hurricane of 1938 made a 450-mile trip from Cape Hatteras, North Carolina to Providence, Rhode Island in 8 hours. So these are stronger hurricanes, tend to be moving very rapidly, much faster than what we would see along the south coast of the U.S. And that has to do with the interaction with our jet stream. So when we start talking about storm duration, this fast-forward motion is actually kind of a benefit for us. It reduces the amount of time we actually have to deal with tropical storm force winds to about 12 hours. Hurricane force winds are generally 3 to 6 hours. The acceleration, the forward motion, would be added to the destructive potential of the wind on the right side of the storm. So pick the direction of motion, look on the right half of the storm, and add the forward motion to that, and that would be your additional destructive potential just from that forward motion. As a general rule of thumb, when you start talking about planning for wind gusts, we'll actually have a forecast for this, but if you want to ballpark it, take your sustained wind and add 50% to it. And as we saw in 1938 at the Blue Hill Observatory, the sustained winds were 120 miles per hour, the peak gust to 186 before the wind equipment failed. And it's roughly about 50% added on. Our storms vary in size. It's not one size fits all. Hurricane Bob, which was our last hurricane in 1991, had a maximum radius of wind of about 25 miles. But the 1938 hurricane was much larger. It was 40 miles away from the center. And that's really going to determine where the greatest wind damage is going to occur And where the highest storm surges will be, again, it's not going to necessarily be where the center of the eye is or the center of the storm. So we really want to focus on the impacts and not so much about the position of the eye. When we start talking about winds and high-rise buildings, once you start getting above the tree level, and particularly once you really start getting high up, the potential for wind damage is significantly greater. So this was a high-rise building in Fort Worth, Texas. It was an F2 intensity, 115 to 140 miles per hour, and it did all sorts of damage in about 5 minutes. So what we want to think about here is how are we going to handle a Category 3 hurricane, which is roughly that same wind speed range, dealing with those winds for a half an hour or even longer. So that is definitely going to be a concern for some of our high-rise buildings. One of the greater threats that we have to talk about, and this is going to potentially impact everybody, is going to be flooding rainfall. When you hear a tropical system, I want you to think flooding. Historically, water is responsible for most deaths in tropical cyclones from both storm surge and from inland flooding. The risk with inland flooding is you don't have to be on the coastline to get it. We have seen recent trends where most deaths have been from inland freshwater flooding of late. That doesn't mean the storm surge threat is to be completely dismissed. Slower, larger storms usually produce more rainfall, but even weak or weakening storms can produce a lot of rainfall. So if you think about it, you have this Category 3 hurricane sitting off the southeast U.S. coast, and it's expected to weaken as it moves north into southern New England. This storm has been very powerful for a long period of time. It's hoisted a lot of water up into the air. As that storm is weakening, it can't support all that water in the air anymore, and it's going to fall down somewhere. So that would actually be where I would be a little bit more concerned about the potential for flooding rainfall for a weakening tropical system coming into our area. How the wet or dry the soils are before this storm arrives is going to have a big impact, as well as local topography. The other thing about flooding rainfall is the storm doesn't have to hit us directly in order to have an impact. It could recurve southeast of Nantucket and still bring a lot of flooding rainfall to portions of Massachusetts, particularly the coastal plain. Typical rainfall historically on average is 6 to 10 inches. It has been more, it has been a little bit less. It's mainly to the left of the track, but not always, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. More than half of the 90 tropical systems or post-tropical cyclones that have impacted southern New England since 1900 have resulted in major river and stream flooding. So that is definitely a concern. One other aspect of flooding rainfall is that the rain can arrive 12 to 15 hours before the eye. It could even arrive before the wind, for that matter. So that also is a consideration for your evacuation decisions if you want to make sure you get those done when it's still dry. Heaviest rainfall, again, is almost always to the left, and the primary track mechanism for that is again, the jet stream interaction. When we look historically at some of our rainfall in the past, we have Hurricane Diane, which was actually a tropical storm when it got up our way. It produced the Massachusetts 24-hour state rainfall record of 18.15 inches in 24 hours, and that 19.75 inches in Westfield, Mass. Fell in about 26, 27 hours. Tremendous amount of rainfall. So you see the track and you see that the heaviest rain was to the left. Same thing with Hurricane Floyd in the graphic on the right. Moved up the coast, and the heaviest rain, again, fell over to the left. We'll take a look at our last hurricane, which was Bob. There it is off the Carolina coast, and you see it's still somewhat circular, but you can already see signs that the rain is starting to move out ahead of the system. It's becoming a bit more asymmetric. And then when it was making landfall in Bourne and Falmouth, all of the rain was generally to the left of the track, and there was actually 80-mile-per-hour sustained winds with gusts to 120 in Falmouth, but the weather was actually dry at the time. So it was kind of a unique experience. We'll take a very quick look at Irene here, this is kind of one of the exceptions to the rule. Irene was a tropical storm. It weakened south of Long Island before it made landfall about 11:30 in the morning. The thick black line is the track of Irene, and you see the heaviest rain was actually in the Connecticut River Valley, and that has to do with topography. So as the wind is coming from east to west across Massachusetts, you get a little bit of a lift up by Worcester. So you see when you get in the Worcester Hills, there's a little maximum of rainfall there in the Worcester Hills, and then it descends again down into the Connecticut River Valley, and then it starts rising again as it's trying to get over the Berkshires in western Massachusetts. And that's where we saw the heaviest rainfall, close to the center, but where you also had some topographic influence to really enhance that rainfall. There were a few fatalities from this rainfall, particularly up into southern Vermont and down in Connecticut are some that come off the top of my head. And a lot of these fatalities were bystanders after the event was over, doing things they probably ought not to have done, like kayaking down a flooded road. One last thing I want to talk about quickly is tornadoes and waterspouts. Just about every tropical system will produce at least one tornado or waterspout. If it's over the ocean, we tend not to get these reported, but they can form hundreds of miles ahead of a tropical storm or hurricane. And 90% of these tornadoes develop in the right front quadrant, particularly in the outer rain bands of the tropical cyclone. So before the main event, we're still going to be watching for tornadoes here real quick. So we'll take a quick look at Cindy and Dennis from 2005 when Cindy on the left was down by Lake Pontchartrain in Louisiana, New Orleans. You see the tornadoes were already up into Mississippi and portions of Georgia, and then when it was approaching the Tennessee Valley, you were getting reports of tornadoes all the way up into eastern North Carolina. Dennis on the right remained over the Gulf of Mexico, and there were still tornadoes reported as far east as Tampa and the western coast of the Florida Peninsula. So it's definitely something that you need to kind of keep in the back of your head, although our region is climatologically not terribly favored for these when we're dealing with tropical cyclones. So I will happily take any questions that you have now.
Thank you, Matt. And for questions, if you have a question, please press *6, and we'll unmute your line here. Again, any questions, *6 for Matt in his presentation? Otherwise, we'll move on. Go ahead with your question.
Hi, my name's Ella. I'm from the Boston Public Health Commission. I was just wondering if you could repeat that statistic about how often New England could see major hurricanes. Thank you.
So how often we could see a major hurricane? That is a tricky question. Statistically, you're looking at generally maybe 1 to 2 in a given 100-year period. Now, that doesn't mean that you couldn't see 2 12 days apart like we did in 1954 with Carol and Edna. But statistically speaking, it's a very infrequent event. There's a very low probability in any given year that we would see a major hurricane. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay. So yeah, just to clarify, a major hurricane that we define as a Category 3 or above. So you'll be looking at 115 mile per hour sustained winds or greater. The return period for a hurricane in general is far more frequent. You're looking at maybe 5 to 7 of those in a 100-year period, with on average one passing near Nantucket about every decade or so.
Great, Matt. Thank you very much, and thank you for that question. We'll now move on in our. Now I'd like to introduce Dan Brown of the National Hurricane Center. Dan's going to present on recent changes to the Hurricane Center's products and their success during the 2017 hurricane season. Dan?
Hey, good morning, everyone. Thanks, Matt, for the segue. I think you'll see some common themes between that presentation and the one I'm going to give. I will add to that last question that we really do have to be a little careful about, only being concerned about major hurricanes. As you saw with Matt's presentation, probably with mine, that it doesn't take a Category 3 storm to produce significant damage and rainfall effects across the northeast U.S. So the first slide here is some of those key successes last year from the Hurricane Center. We'll be talking about these throughout the presentation. A couple of highlights to mention here is that the Hurricane Center track forecasts were very good last year. We'll talk about that and hopefully put that in perspective here in a few slides. I'll also mention that we issued the first ever storm surge warning last year for the United States. These are new warnings that are going to highlight the risk of life-threatening storm surge, and we'll also talk about that here in a few slides. But one thing I'll point out here, too, that I won't cover later on in the webinar is that one thing we tried within the Weather Service last year is to have a decision support coordinator housed at the National Hurricane Center. This person is really helping us to provide consistent messages in the various briefings that both local weather forecast offices and the Hurricane Center are providing to state and local emergency management agencies. So hopefully you're seeing some of that by seeing some consistent messaging and us just trying to do a better job at communicating the various hazards. So if you move on to the next slide, I'll just start with a overall review of the 2017 hurricane season. You can see, and I know that many of you know, last year was a very impactful hurricane season, both busy and impactful. We had 6 major hurricanes in 2017. That was the most number of major hurricanes since 2004. And incredibly enough, those major hurricanes struck land. We had 5 Category 5 landfalls in the Caribbean. 4 of those were from Irma, 1 by Maria. And in the United States, we were impacted by 3 Category 4 landfalls, one of those being Harvey in Texas, Irma in the Florida Keys, and Maria in Puerto Rico, along with Category 1 Hurricane Nate later in the year along the northern Gulf Coast. So all told, last year was the costliest year on record in the United States, with more than $265 billion in damage. Those 3 Category 4 hurricanes became the 2nd, 3rd, and 5th costliest storms in U.S. history. If you go to the next slide, it also kind of puts that season into perspective, showing just how much of the U.S. coastline was under some type of hurricane or tropical storm watch or warning during the 2017 hurricane season. Again, much of the Gulf Coast, Florida, southeast U.S. coast. The Mid-Atlantic was thankfully spared significant impacts last season, and even up in the northeast U.S., Hurricane Jose that sat offshore did bring some tropical storm force winds to portions of southern New England, including Cape Cod. So there were some effects, but again, thankfully, the effects farther north were not as significant as what occurred in the southern parts of the U.S. and the Caribbean. If you go to the next slide, we'll get into talking about that success of our forecast tracks during the 2017 season. As many of you know, and I'll show in a slide or two in a second, that the Hurricane Center track forecasts have been improving over the past couple of decades. The models that the Hurricane Center uses have continued to improve, better computing power, higher resolution, and that is helping us to provide better track forecasts. Last year we also had a lot of strong storms, and the Hurricane Center tends to have lower errors for the stronger storms, which also likely contributed to these lower track errors that we saw in 2017. So we did set those record low track errors, and the track errors for those big storms, the Harvey, Irma, and Maria, were actually even lower than our 5-year average. One thing I like to point out, I'm not sure that we'll be this consistent all the time. In fact, I know we will not be, but that image that's in the upper right-hand corner shows all those hurricanes in a forecast about 3 to 4 days before Maria's landfall in Puerto Rico, that each of those forecasts showed the center of the storm crossing Puerto Rico. Again, very consistent forecast. And also, there was some success there in forecasting Maria's strengthening. Maria did become a Category 4 hurricane before it reached to Puerto Rico. Actually, it was Category 5 for a bit. And the Hurricane Center forecast essentially forecast that storm in all but the very first forecast to be a major hurricane at landfall in Puerto Rico. Now, intensity forecasting is a bit more of a challenge for us at the Hurricane Center. Last year, we had 39 cases of rapid strengthening across the Atlantic Basin, and we forecast about 6 of those correct. It does not sound like a lot, but it's better than we've done in the future. We still have a lot of difficulty in forecasting these rapid changes in strength with storms. One of those successes was ahead of Harvey's landfall in Texas, when our forecast called for Harvey to intensify from a tropical storm to a major hurricane, and that's that image in the lower right-hand picture showing our forecast along with those models. Harvey ended up being a little bit stronger than it was forecast at landfall, but again, those forecasts of Harvey's significant strength and prior to landfall hopefully helped, and I believe it did help the emergency management officials in Texas make better preparation decisions ahead of Harvey's impacts. The next slide will kind of review where we're at with track forecasting at the National Hurricane Center. As I said a second ago, our forecasts have continued to improve decade by decade. I look here, if you look at the line where it says 72 hours at the bottom and go up, you can see all the 3-day forecasts that the Hurricane Center has issued, and we've issued these back since the 1960s. And you can see that the average track forecast error in those forecasts back in the 1960s was more than 400 nautical miles. But again, improvements have been made. This is, again, a really huge testament to computing power, our numerical models, and also better observations. Again, just a tremendous success in these improvements. And you go back to the 1990s, that's when really the Hurricane Center began using some of the more sophisticated track models became available. And again, those models have continued to improve. And last year, 2017, those 3-day forecasts, the average error was only around 80 nautical miles. Again, just tremendous success. If you go to the next slide, this slide shows the intensity forecast errors. And you'll see when this slide appears here that the improvements were not as great for many decades. I'll pause just a second to see if it catches up. But you'll see there that going back into the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and even early part of the 2000s, that again there was not a lot of improvements. You look at that 3-day intensity forecast error, and they're all kind of huddled around or bunched together there just under 20 knots. But in the last decade, there's been a project called the Hurricane Forecast Improvement Project. It's providing the Hurricane Center with some new modeling techniques, and we think we're starting to make some use of that and are seeing maybe some improvements in our intensity forecast as you see those last couple of lines being a little bit lower. We still have a ways to go with intensity forecasting, but again, some signs that maybe we're making some progress. The next slide will show you that as we have improved our track forecasts, that the cone graphic that we issue, hopefully it will show up here in just a second, has continued to shrink with time. So the Hurricane Center's cone graphic is essentially based on the last 5 years of errors, and the circles that carve out that cone are drawn such that about 2/3 of the time the center of the storm should fall within those circles. So about 1/3 of the time that the center can actually move outside of the cone. But if you look at that blue line, the 2008 cone, you'll see that this year's cone, 2018, the red area, is much smaller than it was a decade ago. And again, that's because of the track forecast error improvements. But one thing I like to point out, and Matthew touched upon it too in his presentation, is that a hurricane is not a point. These significant impacts from storm surge, wind, are occurring well away from the center. So as that cone has been shrinking, or as I like to say sometimes, the cone has been on a diet, storms aren't changing in size. So more and more impacts from the storm are occurring outside that cone. So this is a message that we try to really highlight, both with the emergency managers and the public. Again, the cone is not an impact graphic. We have to look at some of the other products the Hurricane Center issues, such as wind speed probability products, to really get a look at what your risk is of receiving tropical storm or hurricane force winds. Cone's a great briefing tool, but again, it's not going to tell you much about potential impacts. The next slide is going to review a couple of the successes from last year as far as new products that the Hurricane Center introduced. One of those products is what we call potential tropical cyclone advisories. And these are advisories in which if the system is forming near land and we think it's going to go on and become a tropical storm or hurricane, so it may be just a kind of broad area low pressure, a tropical wave hasn't formed, then the Hurricane Center can go ahead and start issuing forecasts and putting up our tropical storm and hurricane watches or warnings if the system is going to impact land within that 36 or 48-hour lead time. I know this slide has not shown up yet. Hopefully it will. But the Hurricane Center last year developed this because we knew there was a gap in our watch and warning, us being able to issue these watches and warnings with the appropriate lead time when these systems were forming near the coast. So last year during Tropical Storm Cindy that formed in the Gulf, this was the case again. The system formed near land. We were able to then start these potential tropical cyclone advisories, put up the watches and warnings for the northern Gulf Coast, and it resulted in about a day of additional lead time for those emergency managers and the public to be able to make the preparations ahead of the system. It actually, because of the characteristics of the storms last season, in which we had many that formed near land in the western portion of the Atlantic Basin, we actually used it for 7 different systems in the Atlantic, and 6 of those went on to become a tropical storm or hurricane. So a really good success, and again, this is to try to get those watches and warnings out a little bit sooner. Something that you may not have to worry about quite as much up in the Northeast because we typically don't have storms developing near you. However, there could be a case in which we have a system maybe developing off the coast of the Carolinas, and then maybe it's forecast to move fairly quickly to the north, in which we may need to use this to get place those watches and warnings with the appropriate lead time. The other product that we issued for the first time last season were what we call time of arrival graphics. And these graphics provide both the earliest reasonable and most likely time of arrival of tropical storm force winds. These graphics will become operational during the 2018 hurricane season, and actually have some slides near the end in which I'll go into a little bit more detail on those products. So if we move on to the next slide, this one's going to talk about the debut again of the storm surge watch and warning that I mentioned earlier. If you've been following along the last several hurricane seasons with the Hurricane Center's products and advancements, you'll know that we have been placing more emphasis on the storm surge threat, since it is one of the largest causes of loss of life in the United States from hurricanes. So a few years ago, we introduced a potential storm surge flooding map that I'll show you an example of here in a few minutes. And then last year, a couple years ago, we introduced the storm surge watch and warning as a prototype graphic to get folks used to seeing what a watch and warning would look like, but last year was the year that it actually became a real warning from the National Weather Service about the threat of life-threatening storm surge. Issued the very first one of those during Hurricane Harvey, also issued during Irma. And the next slide, I'll just cover what the meanings of those watches and warnings are. And just like a hurricane watch and warning itself, the lead times for these warnings, watch is about 48 hours. So the storm surge watch is issued about 48 hours ahead of the possibility of life-threatening inundation from some water from storm surge, and then the storm surge warning is issued about 36 hours prior to the arrival of a dangerous storm surge. So again, that's what those watches and warnings are meaning. And again, it's really the product that we want the public to be looking at. And I'll let you go ahead and maybe advance the slide one more time to get me caught up. But again, these products are really what we want the public to be focusing on with that storm surge threat. Again, the easy-to-use product really just highlighting those areas that have a significant risk of life-threatening storm surge. I think I'll pause here just a second to see if we catch up. Hopefully we're not having technical difficulties. Had a little bit of a slowdown as well yesterday. So that's that storm surge watch warning, and here's this next graphic. So if you go ahead and, you may have to hit it one more time to get the full graphic on there, I hope. If not, this one might not be quite as effective if it's just like this. There you go. So one thing I do want to make note of is the fact that, small changes to the tracks of hurricanes, along with changes in intensity and size, can really mean a significant difference on who gets the maximum storm surge, where that occurs, how much storm surge, how high the storm surge can reach, and how far inland it can penetrate. Again, it's all dependent upon these changes in track, and it can be very small. This is an example showing on the left was the observed track of Hurricane Irma last year, making landfall in extreme southwest Florida, just south of the Naples area on the southwest coast of Florida, showing where the maximum storm surge occurred, and that was just to the right of the center. You'll see on the left side of the track that there's not much surge. A lot of the winds remained offshore, meaning that it actually was blowing the water away from the coast rather than on the coast. And as Irma moved northward, it weakened, and there wasn't a lot of winds along the backside of Irma, which meant that there wasn't a lot of surge that was pushed onshore to the left of where Irma made landfall. However, if Irma would have tracked just ever so slightly further to the west, maybe 30 miles, it really would have been a different story for areas like Naples and Fort Myers along the southwest coast of Florida. They could have seen a very much more significant storm surge, and you see that on the right picture there, where you see more areas in red. In fact, many more people could have been affected by the storm surge. So again, these are changes in tracks that we just really can't forecast more than a few hours in advance. So that's why the Hurricane Center's introduced products such as that potential storm surge flooding map, which I'll show in a few minutes, that accounts for all the uncertainty in both track intensity and size when it comes to predicting storm surge. Again, a single track deterministic forecast for surge just doesn't work because we just, again, these small changes make huge differences. If we go on to the next slide, this is one, again, to point out just that storm surge can occur far from the center. Again, I just showed you that Irma made landfall in southwest Florida, yet there was really significant storm surge that occurred well east of the center along the east coast of the state in areas where there was onshore flow. Again, Irma was a very big storm. So places like Miami, you see a couple pictures here near downtown Miami where the seawater flooded the streets. Again, this is not rainwater. This is actually ocean water that was pushed onshore because of the winds. And then you see also up in Jacksonville. And that occurred even a day after landfall. So just remember, a large storm a Sandy-like storm in the northeast can produce significant storm surge very far from the center, something that we do have to be aware of. And again, remember that this is going to be, could be outside of areas that are depicted on that cone graphic. The next slide, I'll just cover really briefly, just to say that last year the Hurricane Center, we were threatened here. Certainly becomes more stressful, like it is for you all as emergency managers and folks that are dealing with preparedness when it does threaten you and your home. Here at the Hurricane Center, we do have a plan, and that was enacted last year. Folks here were sheltering in place during the height of the storm for a couple of days. And because of the significant threat of direct impacts, a couple of forecasters, including myself, were actually sent to our backup site up at the Weather Prediction Center near Washington, D.C., where then we were able to help do some forecasts for some of the other storms that were active at the time and just be prepared in case the Hurricane Center had any issues, which we did not, thankfully. And again, just to highlight the fact that that provided a pretty good test for the Hurricane Center last year in its continuity of operations. The next slide, we'll talk briefly about highlighting really the next few slides about the historical deaths from tropical storms. Matt Belk talked about this in his presentation, that again, most of the deaths are coming from water, not wind, something that we really have been trying to highlight here for several years. Again, that's why we've increased the number of products to help emergency managers and others plan for the storm surge risk and also rainfall. But again, about half the deaths from tropical storms and hurricanes in the United States, and this study was going back more than 50 years, shows, again, most of those are from storm surge. Rainfall-induced flooding causes about another quarter, and then high surf and offshore causes about another 10% of the deaths. So all told, about 9 out of 10 deaths from U.S. landfalling hurricanes or U.S. hurricanes are from water and not wind. The next slide summarizes that a little bit more with Hurricane Harvey last year. As Harvey moved inland, it slowed down, produced just tremendous amounts of rainfall across portions of the upper Texas coast. In fact, it produced more than 60 inches of rain near the Beaumont, Texas area, which actually broke the U.S. tropical cyclone rainfall record for the most rainfall ever recorded in a tropical storm or hurricane that's made landfall in the United States. And with that, it produced just extreme flooding in the Houston metropolitan area, Beaumont area along the upper Texas coast. I had a chance just a couple of weeks ago to visit the rain gauge that actually recorded that maximum amount of rainfall of more than 5 feet of rain. That's on the right-hand picture. And because of all this rainfall, again, it was just a very sad reminder of the fatalities that are caused. Many folks driving into flooded roadways. Again, that's a huge cause of people perishing in floods. But of the 68 direct fatalities in Texas, all but 3 of those were from the freshwater flooding, and Harvey became the deadliest tropical storm or hurricane landfall in Texas in nearly 100 years. So again, just a sad reminder. I know Matt talked about Hurricane Irene. That was another example of, again, just that heavy rainfall, not just at the coast, but spreading inland and causing significant flooding. The next slide, we'll talk about some of the deaths that are occurring both before and after the storm. Dr. Ed Rappaport, our Deputy Director here at the National Hurricane Center, has done a study on, besides the deaths from the direct forces of the storm, from the storm surge, from the heavy rainfall, is what's killing people kind of both before and after the storm. And we are seeing just about as many deaths both before and after the storm as we are during the storm. So one of the things we are trying to start to message is reminding folks when they're doing these preparedness actions, when they're doing their recovery and cleanup, just to kind of take it easy. One of the biggest factors is heart attacks. There's the stress of the storm, people doing things that they typically don't do is causing a lot of heart attacks. And there's also a fair number of deaths being caused by power outages, such as using generators improperly and carbon monoxide poisoning, folks using chainsaws, accidents, people falling off ladders. These are all the various things that people are doing that are injuring or killing people after and before the storm. So hopefully you can help us by maybe helping us message this and getting people to really take the precautions, think about what they're doing. If they need help, seek a neighbor, seek a family member that may have more experience using a chainsaw themselves or being up on a ladder. Again, we're trying to eliminate these numbers of deaths both before and after the storm. So the next slide will transition now really into some reminders about some of the products that the Hurricane Center issues that are fairly new, and then we'll talk briefly about some of the changes for this year. A couple of the products, just to remind you, that are available is one of these is called the Hurricane Center Key Message Graphic. Beginning a couple years ago, we started introducing key messages whenever there's a significant hurricane threat to land to talk about what are the key things that media and emergency managers and the public should be thinking about. And so we usually will list maybe 3 to 4 of these key messages. And last year we started producing this graphic that's in the upper right-hand corner. This past week we actually did that during Alberto and its landfall along the northern Gulf Coast. Again, we're trying to get the message out, talking about the rainfall threat, storm surge threats. If there's uncertainty in the forecast, getting people not to focus on the category of the storm or on the track itself. Again, those are the type of things we're putting in these key messages, and we would love you to share these on your social media accounts as well. The Hurricane Center, again, will provide that graphic as a thumbnail on our website and also share it via social media. Another thing that we did last year to our graphics is to add the storm size on that cone graphic. Again, we've talked about the cone graphic already, but that storm size is on there to help illustrate just how big that storm is, at least at the initial time, to give people to think that, and maybe understand that those hazards are occurring outside the cone, which had pretty positive feedback about that, and that graphic will be available this year again. The default graphic is to show that storm size on top of that cone. The next slide will just be a reminder about that potential storm surge flooding map that I mentioned. Again, these maps account for the uncertainty regarding track intensity and size. Hopefully that slide will show up in just a second. I'm sure when you see it, if you've been looking at the website during the past couple of hurricane seasons, you'll remember what that graphic looks like. And again, the graphic shows the height above ground that the water could reach. Again, it's not showing the flooding footprint. It's not showing exactly what's going to happen or forecast of what's going to happen. It's really depicting that reasonable worst-case scenario. Each of the locations that are on that map have about the amount shown of water. It has about a 10% chance of being met or exceeded. And again, this is the map that we really provided to decision makers to help make those decisions. This map is first issued about 48 hours before the tropical storm force winds arrive, or about the time we issue that initial hurricane watch, and they'll be available through the time that there's a hurricane warning in effect. These maps take a little bit of time to process, so they're not available right when all the other advisory products are issued from the Hurricane Center. It usually is out about an hour or so after that time. But again, just want to remind folks that these maps are really what folks should be planning for, preparing for, but not necessarily what's going to occur. The next slide will highlight the storm surge watch and warning. Again, this is the more public-facing product, as I mentioned earlier. Again, we first issued this last year. Again, it's going to highlight those areas that we really want people to be concerned about, from life-threatening storm surge. And this now is communicated via the graphic, as well as in the Hurricane Center, our text products. The local National Weather Service offices will also be mentioning these storm surge watches and warnings in their products. And again, the watch and warning is actually done on a very collaborative process. The experts here at the National Hurricane Center dealing with storm surge will send out a kind of first cut of where they think we should be placing that storm surge watch and warning, and then the local offices get to see that depiction, and then they can help refine those areas. They can remove areas they may not be as concerned about, or add areas in which there is a concern, and then that comes back to the Hurricane Center, and then we issue it as these graphics. But again, it's done in a very collaborative effort with the local National Weather Service offices. The next slide, we'll briefly talk about what the products are changing for this year. Again, we've made a lot of progress in the past decade. The changes this year are relatively minor as compared to some of the other changes we've made recently. But one thing is, if you read our public advisory, it's the product that has the summary of the watches and warnings, summary of the storm information, and also the hazard information. It's a text product. Typically, we've only covered about the first 48 hours, the first 2 days of the forecast in that product. Again, highlighting on that watch and warning and time period and when we have more information about the hazards. But starting this year, we're going to talk about the track and intensity forecast out beyond that 48-hour period, at least out to 3 days, if not longer in some cases. So that'll be something that we're doing this year. If you also know that the Weather Prediction Center, once the storm moves inland and the system typically becomes a rainfall threat, our folks within the National Weather Service at the Weather Prediction Center begin issuing advisories, and they're actually issuing them right now for what is Tropical Depression Alberto. And they issue those products, and those will now mirror almost exactly what the Hurricane Center advisories look like to kind of give that seamless look at, again, the various hazards associated with the storms as they continue to move inland. And then lastly, and I'll have a couple slides, and you can go ahead and go to the next slide, is those time of arrival graphics. I mentioned those earlier. These have been very popular products, and again, there's really two different versions. So there's a version that will give you the earliest reasonable arrival time of tropical storm force winds. And you know, these products account for the various forecast uncertainties. So as this is being produced, there's realizations within this that will show the storm moving faster or slower maybe than the official forecast, kind of the typical errors that we may make. And so when you see the timelines on here, it does account for that error. And this graphic, the earliest reasonable, if you really want to be certain that your preparations are going to be complete before the winds arrive, we would suggest that you use this graphic, the earliest reasonable time of arrival. If you move on to the next slide, again, it looks the same, but it is the most likely time of arrival graphic. And then you can look at kind of that range, so you can know what the earliest time that the winds could arrive and then the most likely time. And I think that's very helpful for you all as decision makers to know those times. The graphic that you see here also has some color coding underneath those various times listed, and that is our wind speed probability product. So it's giving you the risk, the chance of tropical storm force winds at each location. So with this graphic, it's, again, I think it's very powerful. You can provide both the timing when the winds could arrive and then your risk of receiving tropical storm force winds. And again, we've had pretty good feedback on these graphics, and they become operational here this hurricane season. The last couple slides I'll finish with are just kind of talking about where maybe the Hurricane Center is headed in the future. As I mentioned earlier, we have been part of this Hurricane Forecast Improvement Project. That project is being renewed here soon. And some of the goals of that are, again, to kind of continue to reduce some of our model guidance errors, as well as maybe starting to think about producing a 6 and 7 day hurricane forecast. The Hurricane Center will be testing that internally this year, but I think something, here in the near future, maybe the next few years, maybe something that you'll see from the Hurricane Center will be day 6 and 7 forecast. The last note on that slide I'll highlight is that one thing that we really are doing is trying to improve our risk and hazard communication, and we're going to do some social science work to really take a look at our entire product suite. We'll probably be asking some of you to provide feedback on our products, and some of the ideas that we've already come up with for the future are things that, how can we display both our tropical storm and hurricane watches both at the coast and inland on the graphic? Do we need to provide real-time storm surge guidance beyond just that 48-hour time period. 6 and 7 day forecasts may be coming, and how can we improve both the understanding and the communication of the various hazards associated with hurricanes. So again, this is where we're headed in the near future, and hope to have some of you as part of that. And I believe that's my last slide, so I'll take any questions if there are any.
Thank you, Dan. Great presentation. I appreciate it. We're going to open up. If you have a question, if you could press *6, we'll unmute your line here at the control station. Again, *6 for a question for the National Hurricane Center. We're showing no questions. In the interest of time, we'll move on. At this time, I'd now like to introduce Paul Morey, the Hurricane Program Manager for FEMA Region 1. And Paul will discuss the hurricane evacuation decision-making in the face of uncertainty. Paul?
Hi, good morning. Okay, I was just going to say, while I was waiting for my my introductory slide, I'll give you a little background. So, as Mike said, I'm the FEMA Region 1 Hurricane Program Manager. I work under a program called the National Hurricane Program, and that is a partnership between FEMA, the United States Army Corps of Engineers, and NOAA's National Hurricane Center. Our mission is to provide technical support for hurricane evacuation decision-making, so we do that through planning and real-time response and operations. We actually have two folks that work full-time, two FEMA employees that work full-time at the National Hurricane Center. And when there's any kind of storm threat that necessitates it, myself and my counterparts will deploy down there as needed. Again, so the title of my presentation is Planning for the Threat, Hurricane Evacuation Decision-Making in the Face of Uncertainty. Next slide, please. And I'll kind of be doing a transition from the specific weather considerations and weather products that Matt and Dan discussed into sort of applications of those in the emergency management side. And hopefully this slide will pop in here real quick. While we're waiting for that to load, I did want to say that I would suggest that you go to the National Hurricane Center's website. It's hurricanes.gov. And if you go there, you can find more information on some of the storm surge products and that potential storm surge flooding map that Dan talked about. You can also get a PDF document that's got product descriptions for all the various products they have, because there are quite a few, and that could be helpful to keep that in your EOC. So as emergency managers, some of the key questions that we have during hurricane season, we want to know, are we going to be impacted by the storm? When are the impacts first going to begin? How long are they going to last? What about storm surge? How severe will that be? What areas will be flooded? As Matthew pointed out, inland flooding is very important, especially for us, and it's often overlooked. People get very focused on hurricanes as a coastal phenomenon, and then suddenly here comes the extreme inland flooding. And obviously also wind being a serious issue. I believe actually with Alberto, there were 2 fatalities from a tree falling onto television meteorologists, unfortunately. We also want to know who do we need to evacuate? When does that evacuation need to start, and how long will it take? Next slide, please. And so it's the hurricane evacuation studies, which I'm going to discuss, the various products from the Hurricane Center and the Weather Service that will assist and support you with your hurricane evacuation decision-making. Next slide, please. So there's 5 various analysis on the hurricane evacuation study, and I'll go ahead and go through each one of those, just a very sort of quick overview just to get you familiarized with those analyses. As we go forward, you can kind of think of each one of the analysis in the hurricane evacuation study, or HES, as being kind of layers, one that builds upon another. So the first one is the hazards analysis. I was mentioned earlier that it's water that causes most of the fatalities in tropical cyclones, particularly storm surge as a coastal phenomenon. It's got the highest potential for death and damage. It's the reason that we evacuate the coast. Next slide, please. And we use worst case scenario surge maps to assess the risk in your community as the first step in developing your hurricane evacuation study, and also giving you a planning and response tool. And I'll talk a little bit about how those are created when this next slide comes up. If you look at the bottom right-hand corner graphic right now, you can see that's an actual, sometimes referred to as a slosh map, storm tide risk map. We'll call it a storm surge risk map right now. And many of you, I assume, are probably familiar with those. So the way that those maps are created, the National Hurricane Center runs their slosh model, which then the output is what we call a MOM, or a maximum of maximum storm surge potential, essentially to try and capture as many of the possible storms that could take place in a given area, given the type of climatology that they have. They'll simulate, using that model, thousands of different scenarios. So they'll use different intensities like sustained wind speed. They'll look at various pressures, the angles of approach to the coast, the forward speed of the storm, and the wind radii, which is really important because we'll talk about it a little bit later that the size of the eye can make a big difference when it comes to storm surge, both a small radius of maximum winds and a higher one, and that's going to be a very important concept to understand. Next slide, please. When you get those maps, you're going to see 4 categories. In each one of those, you'll see the storm surge risk area. And just a point to remember that those maps, those slosh maps or storm surge risk maps, keep in mind that those, again, they're pre-computed. Those are risk maps. They're worst case scenario. They're available year round, and they're intended to be used at longer time frames because there's enough uncertainty in the forecast at, say, 5, 6, 7, even 4 days out, that you're not going to have an operational forecast at that time. But you do need something to work with to start looking at areas that might need to evacuate. So now that you've got the hazards analysis, you know what areas are under risk of worst case storm surge flooding. We then create the evacuation zones. The reason that you have the zones is to be able to communicate risk to the public, so the public can understand what zone they're in and if there's an evacuation called for them. It helps you communicate evacuation orders by zone. It helps you phase your evacuation. So early on, you may say, we're recommending an evacuation zone A, and then later on, well, now we need to do zone B as the threat changes. Next slide, please. In the 2 graphics that you can see, one on the left is storm surge risk map, and the one on the right were evacuation zones that were built using the storm surge risk map as the platform for that. The next analysis is the vulnerability analysis. So that's essentially going to tell you within those evacuation zones, so who resides in those zones that may need to evacuate and what facilities are at risk. There's typically the normal, I'll call it like the suite of emergency management concerns in terms of critical facilities. So hospitals, fire stations, police stations, things like that. When the hurricane evacuation studies are developed, though, some states, jurisdictions may choose to put other particular types of facilities that they want to know about. And this is just an example from the Massachusetts hurricane evacuation study where you can see by town, by evacuation zone, the facility, the address. And so all that is good planning data. I did want to reinforce that the HES isn't just something that you just take out during hurricane season, but you can use it at any time to take this data out and inform your hurricane response plan, use it for a hazard mitigation plan or many other plans that you might be working on, because that data is already there and yours to use. Next slide, please. The next step is the hurricane behavioral analysis. So there's a few key pieces of information that we need to get from this behavioral analysis. Probably the most important ones are finding out the public's intent to evacuate. Will they evacuate given a certain storm scenario? Have they evacuated in the past? Why they would or wouldn't leave? Where they're going to go and how they're going to get there, so evacuation destinations and routes. That's very important because that gives our transportation engineer the ability to, in his or her model, to be able to load up the roadway appropriately as it would be in an actual evacuation. We do also ask other questions. We ask about attitudes of risk, particularly storm surge. May not be surprising that nationwide the results of those surveys come back that consistently people are under-concerned about risk, even when their houses are extremely close to the water. They're more worried about wind and power outages than sort of having the realization of the credible amount of danger that they're in. We also ask, as an example, things like sources of forecast information, and that's useful for us in the emergency management world, and also for the folks at the Hurricane Center and the local weather forecast office, so we can know, if we know where people are getting the weather, how they're receiving those messages, and those types of results can drive things like the key messages, social media posts that Dan showed earlier. Next slide, please. And the behavioral analysis that we did in Southern New England, so each one of the states, we had several hundred surveys within our evacuation zone A, which is for a Category 1 and 2 storm, several hundred in evacuation zone B, which is Category 3 and 4, and then even some surveys outside of any storm surge risk area, because there are people we call them shadow evacuees, that do tend to evacuate even when not needed to, and they need to be accounted for when you do the transportation analysis. The next analysis is shelter analysis. Just from the start, I just want to say that the National Hurricane Program is not really a sheltering program. We don't do mass care. We don't do assessments of the structural integrity of shelters or anything like that. But because within our study, we need to find what types of facilities are in those storm surge risk areas and evacuation zones. Part of that is identifying the shelters, and particularly, like I said in the behavioral analysis, if we're trying to load up the roadways for the transportation model, we need to know, okay, we're making an assumption that a certain percent of the population that's leaving will go to shelters, and it's going to be these shelters. A certain percent of the population is going to go to friends or relatives out of the area or in the area. They're going to go to hotels. So we're sort of collecting that information to drive our transportation analysis, which is the last one that I'll discuss. Through that, we can get a potential shelter demand and capacity, and then we also look at the flood risk of those shelters, again, where we can actually locate them within whatever evacuation zone, or if they're out of it. In the bottom right, you can just see an example of what that looks like in a tabular format. Next slide, please. So the final analysis, the transportation analysis. So again, recapping. We've got our hazards analysis. We know what areas are at risk for worst-case storm surge flooding. We've then created evacuation zones. We looked at the vulnerability within those zones, so we know the population that resides in them and what facilities. We know assumptions about how people may behave, whether or not they'll evacuate and where they're going to go. We've got shelter locations. And then for the transportation analysis, sort of the last piece, all of that information is fed into a transportation model. And essentially, the main things that you're looking at are the traffic patterns that are largely driven by bottlenecks and the amount of evacuating vehicles. So, you know, if a particular road can handle 500 cars per hour, but in this scenario, we're looking at, you know, 1,000 or 2,000 vehicles per hour, you know, that's going to affect the overall speed of the evacuation. All said and done, the final product that is provided in the hurricane evacuation study are clearance time tables. Clearance times they're really variables of response. So how slowly or quickly do folks pack up their car and evacuate, and that's subjective. So it can be, you know, driven by what's the current weather conditions. Is it blue skies? Is it a hard sell to evacuate people? Is the storm on the way, you know, quickly, and they're a larger threat, and they're likely to hop in the cars and leave a little bit earlier. The second one is population. So is it a high tourist season? Is it off season? Obviously, if you're looking at Cape Cod, it's going to have a tremendous increase in population that may need to evacuate. And then you can have evacuation scenarios. Ours are just a standard scenario. There are other states that do things like one-way or contraflow, and those are typically done in the south, where they might have, you know, much larger populations evacuating, and also broader areas that are at risk from flooding than we do. Our topography tends to be a little more steep in most areas, so we may not need to go hundreds of miles to evacuate, but maybe tens of miles. And then lastly, the clearance time tables, last variable is the storm category. So essentially, just as an example, you may look at what's my clearance time for a category 2, standard evacuation during high tourist season with a slow response. And so you're going to get, you know, multiple numbers of clearance times given each possible scenario. Next slide, please. And so now I'm just going to give a couple of examples to explain a little bit more what exactly is meant by evacuation clearance time and sort of how the calculation works. So in this example, and I did underline example because we don't have the clearance time of 48 hours in Massachusetts, or excuse me, in any of New England really. I believe our longest is about maybe 33, 34 hours under a worst case scenario in Cape Cod. An evacuation clearance time doesn't mean that that's the total time someone's going to be sitting in traffic. It actually means that it begins when the first evacuating vehicle enters the road network, and it ends when the last vehicle reaches an assumed point of safety. So it's the entire process of the evacuation. It's also a very conservative number because there's an assumption that 100% of the population within an evacuation zone will be leaving. We know that's not true, but you have to give, in the interest of public safety, use numbers that allow everybody the opportunity to leave. There are some hurricane evacuation studies where you could look at smaller numbers of evacuation participants to see what the differences are. Also, don't forget that these evacuation clearance times are by category of storm as well. And they're accounting, those MOMs are worst case, so they're accounting for all these different, you know, possible storms. So there's a lot of safety buffer that's built in. And as you move to the right, you can see that, you know, H equals 0 is the forecast onset of tropical storm force winds or surge or other hazards. So you have to have the entire evacuation complete before the onset of those hazards. Within HUREVAC, for those that are familiar, the calculation is based on the onset of the tropical storm force winds for completion of your evacuation. But I did add surge or hazards in here. As was mentioned earlier, you could have storm surge far out ahead of the onset of tropical storm force winds. That is something that's possible. Or you may have, as Matt mentioned, you could have serious inland flooding out ahead of the storm. and that may cut off some of your evacuation routes or otherwise hinder your response. Next slide, please. And I believe the next one is just going to show you sort of how the calculation works. And this is all done automatically in HURRAVAC rather than have to take out your calculators. The National Hurricane Center issues their forecast advisories every 6 hours that give you all the information you need to know about the storm. In this example, the main thing that you're going to use for your clearance times is category. So for a Category 3 storm, the forecast arrival of tropical storm force winds is in 25 hours. You have your clearance time that comes from your predetermined evacuation zones within the hurricane evacuation study. You're going to subtract that. So in this case, 11 hours, showing that you have an evacuation start time of 14 hours. So you've got 14 hours to start that evacuation. Again, just as an example. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the hurricane evacuation study can be accessed in different ways. I believe the Army Corps of Engineers New England District has them published on their website. You could Google that. I apologize, I don't have the address right here. The state, I believe, MEMA, had also distributed them to the coastal communities. And another way that they can be found, this is the new, or an example of the new version of HURRAVAC, a web-based version. It's still in experimental phase right now. It'll be running this summer, being beta tested, and then next season will be the official operational version of HURRAVAC. We're calling it HVX right now. To step back, there is a file resource library within HVX where you could find your hurricane evacuation study and your storm surge risk maps. So that's something kind of new that we didn't have in the legacy HURRAVAC. Among other things, that's going to be very helpful. Next slide, please. And I should say also, just like the legacy HURRAVAC, you can open up the program and given the storm forecast at the time, you can run reports that give you your evacuation start time, or wind timing, and various other reports that you'd need to update every time there's a new forecast for your decision making. Just a few more slides, but just in summary for the hurricane evacuation study, it informs your plans with data from those 5 analysis, supports your response operations by providing you information on which populations and facilities to evacuate, shelter risk capacity and demand. Timing guidance from that hurricane evacuation study is loaded into HURRAVAC already. Those evacuation clearance times for specific storm scenarios that you need, and information on critical traffic bottlenecks and suggested traffic control points. You can go to the next slide, but that last bullet, there is some pretty detailed information within your hurricane evacuation study about what areas are critical to keep the traffic flowing, those particular bottlenecks, other information like railroad crossings along evacuation routes, and which companies are running those railroads that you may need to coordinate with prior to any evacuation. So just a real quick hurricane scenario that I like to throw out there, just a little bit of food for thought in terms of being able to make decisions or the challenges of making decisions in the face of uncertainty. This is, for our example here, this is Advisory 40 from the National Hurricane Center. It's issued at 11 a.m. on Saturday, August 31st, so it's a busy tourist season. It's a major hurricane, Category 3. It's moving at 13 miles an hour, and it's located off the coast of Georgia and South Carolina. So it looks like blue skies in Massachusetts and a storm that's seemingly far away. We're going to assume a 24-hour clearance time for this scenario, so we're going to call it Cape Cod. So at this time, do you mobilize your response assets? Do you call for an evacuation? When do you need to take action, given this forecast, the example in this forecast? Next slide, please. see if there we go. So for those that remember, this was actually Hurricane Eduardo in 1996. In this scenario, if you had a 24-ounce clearance time, and remember it's Saturday morning, your evacuations would have to begin early Sunday morning in order to be complete before the onset of those tropical storm force winds. So that leaves 24 hours from the issuance of this advisory to make an evacuation decision, notify the public, mobilize your response assets like state police, traffic control points, harbor master, all of those, big muscle movements and local actions as well. So how many more advisories will you have to influence your decision-making considering your timeline? It's all about hours until impact. That's how your hurricane response plan should be thought of, not really the geographic location of the storm in boxes, but more about your timeline. And it's really a fluid timeline in terms of each storm has a different forward speed and characteristics. Next slide, please. When I looked at the Saturday morning at 11 advisory in this example, I went back in HRVAC to do this. I advanced the storm through by hour. Given that forecast, that's what you would see, and you would have if you didn't have any more time, you would need to make your call based on this forecast. In reality, what ended up happening is the storm did curve to the northeast and then the east. I don't think it had any effect, maybe a glancing blow on Cape Cod, but not anything that necessitated evacuation. That said, with my last question, how many more advisories will you have to influence your decision-making considering your timeline? There's a new advisory every 6 hours, so you kind of need to look ahead and say, when's the last possible forecast going to be issued that I can use to make my decision? So again, thinking about the timeline overall. Next slide, please. And looks like it's partway up. There we go. So these key forecast products, your clearance times from the hurricane evacuation study, your particular local planning factors, those all guide your evacuation decision-making and response actions. I have a few examples. The storm surge watch and warning down the bottom left-hand corner that Dan discussed, that should ideally trigger action by the public, and could also be factored into your timelines to take particular actions. And also understanding that forecast potential storm surge flooding map, that will come out concurrently with the storm surge watch or warning. So remember the storm surge risk maps I talked about at the beginning, those are year-round, those are not forecast. Use those at a longer time frame. And then you'll have that potential storm surge flooding map and watches and warnings if necessary as you get closer to the onset of hazards, and so that sort of guides your decision making as well. I'm not going to go through each one of them, but as you see, you kind of get the idea from these graphics that 5 days out and longer, the Hurricane Center and the National Weather Service can give you a little more limited information on the storm because there's enough uncertainty at that time that you're not really going to get till too drilled into something to make very specific decision with the accuracy just isn't there at 5 days out. But as the storm gets closer and closer in time, those forecasts become more accurate, and you therefore get more products to use for your decision making. Again, if you go to hurricane.gov/surge, you can get that little triangle on the bottom right and get more information about the various storm surge products. Next slide, please. Thank you. I think this may be my last slide. The various storm surge products and surge forecasting can get a little bit confusing. Stepping back, when I talk about your evacuation zones, and those are built using these thousands of different simulated storms. In that case, we're correlating. The Hurricane Center is correlating the category of storm to that particular storm surge threat because they're factoring in, all of the different possibilities for a storm. So, if they're looking at a Category 1 storm, they're looking at a really big one, a really small one, a slow one, a fast one. So that's going to be different than when you get closer in time to the onset of the storm, and you're really looking at, or they're really looking at, the key characteristics of that particular storm as it's approaching your area. So in that case, what I want my sort of take-home message to be is, and this is going to run across the board when I say think impacts, not looking just at the cone, but looking at all the particular impacts, is that surge, rainfall, pressure fit the scale like a square peg in a round hole. So the graphic in the middle, that's an older graphic. You may still be able to find it online. If you do, just ignore it. And what it does is it shows you the category of hurricane on the left side, and then a correlating level of storm surge on the right side. It's been found over time and through experience that there is not a direct correlation per se. So in this example, if we look at Hurricane Charlie that affected Florida, it was a Category 4. So according to this chart, you'd see, Category 4 has extreme storm surge, 13 to 18 feet. Well, in reality, I believe it was more like 6 or 7 feet, which is still significant, but quite a bit less than would have been expected if you just looked at the storm surge threat by category. Moving up, Sandy, that was an extratropical storm or a weak tropical storm, or however you'd like to label it. I think the news media has all kinds of creative names. It doesn't really matter. It did have lower wind speeds as it came ashore in the New Jersey area, but the storm surge was extensive. So you're looking at, let's see, about 13, 14 feet, might have been the highest. And, it goes without saying, obviously if you looked at the media, you're in emergency management, you saw the extreme amount of destruction that Sandy caused in New Jersey, New York, even along the Connecticut coastline and Rhode Island coastline. So the trick with that is that Sandy was a very, very large storm with a huge wind field. So even though the winds weren't that strong, it was pushing a massive amount of water towards the coastline. Conversely, Charlie was a very, very small storm, compact storm, even though it had strong winds, so it was not pushing as much water into the shore. Two more examples, Hurricane Ike that I believe affected maybe Texas, Louisiana. That was a quote-unquote only a Category 2, but still resulted in catastrophic surge damage. And then Katrina, of course, was a Category 3 and was catastrophic damage. So can't really just say one for one. Particularly in our area, storms tend to sort of start, for lack of a better term, sort of falling apart and getting larger. So, that could affect our level of surge. All the different there's just so many characteristics that you have to keep in mind. So you really want to, hang your hat on what the National Hurricane Center and what the National Weather Service are saying regarding these are the impacts we're expecting. Whatever the category is, we're looking at this much rainfall and then flooding. We're looking at this in terms of storm surge, and sort of try to think about it in that context, and to use some of the probabilistic products that they put out there, the tropical windstorm, tropical force wind speed probabilities, things like that, that take into account that uncertainty. Next slide, please. That's it for me. I really hope I didn't go too long. That's my, you'll see my contact information there. Please feel free to email me or call me anytime, and I would be happy to give you more information regarding the National Hurricane Program, or just to answer any questions you have in general. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. We'll now turn it to we'll open it up for a couple of questions. Again, if you have a question, please press *6 for Paul. Not seeing any in the queue, but again, *6 if you have a question. We're not seeing any, so we'll end our Q&A. Thank you. And now introducing Director Kurt Schwartz of MEMA, who will cover our state and emergency management and preparedness updates. Director?
Thank you, Mike. Let me follow on Paul's discussion about evacuation planning and evacuation operations with a few comments. First, the hurricane evacuation study for Massachusetts that Paul referenced, it is available in HurEvac. So for those of you who are HurEvac users, the full evacuation study is available in the HurEvac resource library. It is also in the file library of MEMA's web EOC. So if you are a user and have access to MEMA's web EOC, just go into the file library. You'll find the full hurricane evacuation study and a separate document with all of the clearance times for all of our coastal communities. Why are we focusing on and really emphasizing evacuation planning? I want to go back to the statistics discussion that Matt Belk referenced. The statistical return rate for a hurricane or a major hurricane in Massachusetts, or statistically how often do we experience a hurricane or a major hurricane, whether we're looking at the stats for a Category 1 or 2 hurricane, or we're looking at the stats for a Category 3 or 4 hurricane. Either way, statistically, we are well overdue to be hit here in Massachusetts. So that's why we're really focusing on evacuations, because we have not had to do this in many years. Let me talk about some resources that are available to you from MEMA to help you with evacuation planning. And I want to talk about two types of maps that are available to you on our website. First, inundation maps, and then second, evacuation zone maps. Let's start with inundation maps. The inundation maps for all coastal communities in Massachusetts were created, I think, and published, I think, maybe in 2014, created in a joint effort between FEMA and U.S. Army Corps, and then rolled out with MEMA and in collaboration with our coastal communities. These maps are extremely helpful as planning tools to you at the local level. They are what you can go to today, tomorrow in planning and say, what is the worst case scenario in my community for coastal flooding from a hurricane? These are, as Paul referenced, risk maps. They are not forecast maps for any particular storm. Our inundation maps are in 4 colors and have in the legend Category 1, 2, 3, and 4. Consistent with what Paul was just saying to you, I suggest you ignore the categories and just think of these as 4 different levels of flooding from least to most, meaning the light green or Category 1 areas of maps. And let me go to a map as we're talking. So the light green or Category 1 are going to be the areas that would flood first. And I'm just waiting for the map to catch up. Bear with me one more moment. These slides that I'm passing over, which will be available to you, tell you where on our website these maps are located and how to get to them. Okay, so again, the light green are the areas that are going to flood first with a storm with the lowest amount of surge. All the way up to the pink areas are the areas that are going to flood with the maximum amount of surge. And again, these are MOMS, maximum, worst case scenarios. For you to do pre-storm planning and to help you, identify areas that will flood, as well as the people and types of facilities in those areas that potentially may flood. And again, on our website, there are two types of inundation maps. What you're looking at right now is an interactive map of the entire coastline of Massachusetts. You can zoom in and out, and we're going to wait. And now what you're looking at, which we also have on our website, are community-specific inundation maps. These are PDFs. There's one for every coastal community. They show a great deal of detail. You can zoom in also on these down to, as you can see, right down to the street level. Here we're showing the Fairhaven, Mattacushnet area, just to give you a sense of how these maps work. And again, if you zoom in, you'd see 4 levels of flooding. But again, those light green areas are going to flood first. So those are inundation maps, which again, these are a planning tool. To show you one more example of an inundation map as soon as screen changes. And there you have it. That's looking at Wareham, the Wareham area. Again, showing you the worst case scenario for a tropical cyclone in your area. But note, when you look at this map, if we were to have a hurricane with very significant inundation, look at the amount of land area that potentially will flood. We also have evacuation zone maps. The evacuation zone maps were created by using the inundation maps. The inundation maps tell us the areas that potentially could flood, and then from those maps, the FEMA and the Army Corps built evacuation zones. In Massachusetts, we have 3 evacuation zones, A, B, and C. All coastal communities have a Zone A and a Zone B. Only Boston and Cambridge also have a Zone C. Again, these maps are available on our website. The presentation will tell you how to get to them. And now I'm going to show you an example of an evacuation zone map. And again, we have an interactive map viewer where you can look at the whole coastline and then zoom in. And we also have evacuation zone maps, which are PDF files for every single coastal community. So hopefully in a moment, the first map will come up on your screen. Should change in a moment. This is just telling you how to get to the map. And here we have a view using our interactive viewer on our website. Again, looks like I'm looking at the Wareham area, the top of Buzzards Bay. And for this area, there are only 2 evacuation zones, A and B. Zone A is the area that will flood first, and Zone B is the area that will flood last with a bigger storm that has more significant inundation. Let me show you another example. And here we're looking at the Boston Harbor, Boston, Cambridge area up into Chelsea. And you'll see for Boston, as I said, we have a Zone A, B, and C. Zone C was added because of the unique impacts of a storm that might come in going more east to west. If Boston ever or Cambridge called for a Zone C evacuation, it would also include Zones A and B. So again, there's an example from our interactive viewer. I will also show you what a PDF map looks like of a specific community, the PDF evacuation zone map. Just wait for this to change. And while we're waiting for it to change, let me speak to the issue. How would you at the local level know which zone to evacuate as a storm is approaching? As a storm approaches, and particularly when it gets to be about 48 hours before landfall, the National Hurricane Center and the National Weather Service will publish potential storm surge flood maps. And those are really, those are not maximum of maximums, but they're publishing the maps of the worst case scenarios for this particular storm. What we would do at MEMA, along with the Hurricane Center and the Weather Service, is take those potential storm surge maps, overlay them on our evacuation zone maps to see the areas that will potentially flood with this storm, and that will tell us which zones we would recommend evacuating. And then we would communicate that information out to all of our local partners to help you make that decision. So looks like we may be stuck here, but let's move ahead. There we go. It looks like it's about to change. And again, there's an evacuation zone map, a PDF map. Again, it looks like it's of Wareham. And these are available to you on the website. So beyond doing evacuation planning now, I'm going to just take a moment to suggest to you at the local level some other areas that you may want to focus in on in terms of hurricane season planning in the coming weeks and months. We tend to hope that our hurricane season here in New England doesn't really start until we get into mid-July, so we still have some time to do planning before we're under the threat of an actual system. So suggested areas that you may want to focus on. First, identifying points of distribution within your communities and developing staffing and operational plans for those points of distribution. Second, identifying your sources for critical commodities. For example, if your community is hit hard, you have a lot of displaced people, if your community looks like those bottom two pictures, you may need to provide food and water outside of shelters to people who are not in shelters but do not have food and water. In most instances, you would do that through a point of distribution or a pod site. We regard it as our responsibility at MEMA to deliver to your pods the critical commodities that you need and don't have. So if you've gone through your food and water supplies and don't have a source for food and water, then it's our responsibility to get you food and water. We'll deliver that to your pod site and expect that at the local level you're going to have a pod site and a capacity to operate your pod site and and staff your pod site. Third, now's the time to make sure you have a debris management plan. Again, look at those bottom two pictures. The picture on the bottom left is what your community might look like after you've completed your emergency debris clearance, meaning you've used heavy equipment, opened up your roads by pushing the debris to the sides of the road. That's just the start of a very long-term debris management process. We would hope that debris clearance is completed in the first 24, 48, maybe 72 hours post-landfall. But picking up and hauling and moving all of that debris can take months. You have to have a debris management plan, and if you hope to be reimbursed by FEMA for your costs, that plan has to meet a lot of state and federal guidelines. Now is the time to develop that plan. A couple other areas you may want to focus on now. Identifying the people in your community with access and functional needs, and the people in your community who do not have their own vehicles, so they have critical transportation needs, meaning if you call for an evacuation, do you know where your people are that don't have transportation, and do you know how you're going to help move them out of harm's way? Related point, develop your critical transportation needs plan, and we very much hope that your local transportation needs plan is consistent with the state plan, which you will find on our website, mass.gov/MEMA. There is a state critical transportation needs plan. Again, in terms of state versus local responsibility, we deem it to be a local responsibility for you to have a way to pick up people within your community who don't have their own vehicles, don't have transportation, and for you to move them to one or more transportation hubs in your community. We deem it a state responsibility to work with you to send buses to your transportation hubs and to transport your residents out of the community to a state reception center where we will assess them and move them into the state shelter system. And that is a segue to my last recommended area of planning, which is sheltering. Now is the time to look at your shelter plans and really determine whether you have adequate staffing plans, the personnel to operate your shelters. Do you have adequate supplies, your cots, your durable medical equipment, etc.? Do you have sufficient sources for food and water to take care of the people in your shelters? And do you have the capabilities to manage people who have access and functional needs? Again, the state is always prepared through MEMA to support local sheltering operations, but if we're hit with a significant hurricane and have 40 communities that are hit hard and have a lot of sheltering needs, the longer you can conduct operations at the local level without having to turn to the state for help, the better off you'll be. I'm going to pass the microphone to Mike Russus, who's going to talk for a moment on some of the state-level preparedness activities we have going on for this season.
Thank you, Director. For the last several years, MEMA has, in coordination with many partners from across the regional, state, federal, non-governmental, and private sector organizations to collaborate on hurricane season planning and pre-landfall coordination. So as this slide loads, you'll see the groups for which we pull together. Over the course of the next several weeks, MEMA will convene a series of working group meetings where, again, we bring many of our stakeholders and partners together to review capabilities, identify gaps, review missions and priorities. We'll look at lessons learned from even 2017's hurricane season as it applied to Puerto Rico, Texas, and Florida, and what we could apply here in the Commonwealth in terms of lessons learned to ensure that our thinking and our forward planning is mindful of all of the lessons learned that are available to us. The groups that you're seeing in front of you, again, include air operations, communications, debris management, energy and utilities, evacuation and transportation, fuel planning. And on the next slide, we have mass care and sheltering, mass feeding and commodities, search and rescue, state staging, rapid impact assessments, and distribution of critical commodities. And again, for the last several years, we've brought these groups together. We'll meet throughout the summer via a number of different planning sessions where we're asking all of our partners to, again, identify what their gap or what their capabilities are first and foremost. Each season and every time we do this, capabilities will naturally change. We'll discuss critical areas of concern. You know, where is the state? Are we in a position to efficiently and effectively support communities with resource requests for support in these areas? And really identify ways in which we will coordinate here at the State EOC, communicate with incident commanders or emergency operations center personnel in the field, and to talk through what deployment would look like for many of these capability sets. So for example, if we look at search and rescue, our typical attendee lists include representatives from Department of Fire Services, the Mass National Guard, Mass Task Force 1, Mass Environmental Law Enforcement, the Department of Conservation and Recreation, Southeastern Massachusetts Technical Rescue Team, Fire Chiefs Association of Massachusetts, FEMA, and a whole host of other stakeholders. And again, we're ensuring that across all of our areas of expertise, we have a coordinated response to effectively support search and rescue for communities that need that level of support. And then as we move closer to the hurricane season, once a storm is in the Caribbean and has its sights for New England, we start to, as part of our activation process, bring together many of, or if not most of these groups back into the State EOC to start talking about implementing many of the strategies and plans that we've developed over the summer. So going back to search and rescue, 4 or 5 days out, we're looking at identifying staging areas, identifying which teams and assets are most available and ready to support communities, what lines of communication are necessary, and really starting to put into the motion many of the planning elements that we had discussed over the summer months. So again, from a pre-landfall coordination perspective, we're getting a lot of wheels in motion, if you will. The director will next talk about a lot of our activities, what you can expect from MEMA, but many of these activities will naturally be highlighted in our situational awareness statements to discuss each of the planning assumptions and really the work that we're going into that storm with. So back to you, Director.
Thank you. So for your awareness, this will be our last slide. So we're just about to the end, and we'll, again, open it up for questions and answers at the end. So just want to touch on what you can expect as from MEMA in the sort of pre-landfall period of time, in that 5-7 days out all the way up to landfall. Just waiting for the slide to load, but first you should expect and can rely on us to provide you timely information on any tropical system or potential tropical system that may threaten Massachusetts. Like many of you, we stay tuned in to the Weather Service, National Hurricane Center. Look at all tropical systems. You're not going to get situational awareness statements from us unless there's some reason to be concerned about the system impacting Massachusetts. At the point, we think there's a concern, there is a potential, we're going to start our situational awareness statements. That could be 5 days out. It might be 3 days out. It just depends on the system. The early situational awareness statements, when the storm is considerable distance away, those situational statements will be fairly brief. They're just alerting you to the storm and its potential track. But, you know, a storm that is as far out as the one you're looking at on the screen, which is, you know, 5-7 days out, it's too early to talk about potential impacts. We just want, at that point, you to be aware of and start thinking and doing some, you know, long-range planning. As the storm progresses and, you know, looking at the, you know, Tropical Storm Jose, which ultimately didn't hit us, but as Jose progressed last year, as it got closer, and if this were this year, as it gets closer, you're going to get more detailed situational awareness statements from us. We're going to begin to focus on the potential impacts, you know, thinking about rainfall and how much rainfall and inland flooding, thinking about winds, what are the maximum winds, also talking about potential for tornadoes. We're going to focus a lot on storm surge flooding, and certainly once the storm is within 48 hours and the Hurricane Center is publishing the potential storm surge maps, we're going to be providing those maps to you, but with a good deal of analysis, meaning we're going to get down to the community level to make sure you're aware of the potential storm surge in your communities. And, you know, depending on the time of year, and certainly if this is over the summer season, we'll also be focusing on, you know, the beach issues, riptide, swell, wave action along the beaches. Again, as the storm gets closer, we'll initiate once or twice daily conference calls along with the National Weather Service and the National Hurricane Center, so that we're talking to you about all of the issues and opening you know, the phone lines for questions, answers, discussions. We're prepared to support you with emergency notifications to the residents of your communities. We can support you with the wireless emergency alert system and the emergency alert system. So particularly if you're going to make evacuation recommendations or orders at the local level and you need to get that information out, almost all communities have ways to communicate, whether it's reverse 911 systems, but we can also help you with that, particularly through wireless emergency alerts to cell phones. Again, as the storm gets closer, the State Emergency Operations Center will be activated. We typically activate 48 to 72 hours in advance of landfall to begin all the pre-landfall coordination and planning, including starting to stage resources near your communities. If we're going to have significant storm surge, as you saw us do last January and again last March with our coastal flooding storms, we would stage high water rescue vehicles and resources, swift water. We would work with our search and rescue ESF to stage swift water rescue resources as well. We'll be working with FEMA to stage commodities and other resources that we're working with FEMA to stage in the Commonwealth. So a lot of activities. And then certainly post-landfall, the State Emergency Operations Center will do what we do with you in all storms and disasters, that coordination always starting with life safety coordination around things like search and rescue, incident stabilization, public safety stabilization through law enforcement, fire, EMS, mutual aid coordination, and then starting to focus on distribution of critical commodities, supporting emergency debris clearance so you can get your roads open, et cetera. So I want to end by saying that here at MEMA we have for the second season stood up an 8 or 9 person hurricane decision support team. They are all members of our staff who have undergone advanced training with the Hurricane Center and the National Weather Service. and their role is internally to provide situational awareness, guidance, and direction to staff here at MEMA. But they are also available to you at the local level if you need technical assistance, advice, guidance, that our team is available to you. All you need to do is reach out to your regional MEMA office to tap into our decision support team. And finally, through the whole planning process starting today, if you need any support from MEMA in your planning, whether it's pod planning, shelter planning, whatever it may be, please, all you have to do is ask your regional MEMA office for support, and we will make sure you get the support you need. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Mike. We've gone a few minutes over, but we still have about 140 people on the phone.
Thank you, Director. And at this time, we'll now open it up for questions. Please dial *6, and we'll unmute your line as they come in. And again, *6 if you have any questions. We're not showing any at this time. Okay, without any question, I will now conclude today's webinar. If you have any other questions, as the Director had noted, please contact your MEMA regional office, MEMA headquarters, or any of today's speakers. Once you leave today's webinar, you'll receive a survey on the presentation. We'd really appreciate it if you could complete the survey and provide your feedback as we think about future hurricane preparedness webinars. As I had noted earlier, all of today's presentations will be posted on MEMA's website. And at this point, I would now like to turn it back to Director Schwartz for closing comments. Thank you.
Again, thank you to the 160 or so people and organizations that participated today on top of the 185 yesterday. Again, I want to thank FEMA, National Hurricane Center, National Weather Service for helping us put this together, and in particular thank Matt Belk from the National Weather Service, Dan Brown, National Hurricane Center, Paul Morey, FEMA, Mike Russis here at MEMA, Dave Bryant, and our training and exercise unit that put this whole thing together. And I just, again, close by saying if you need any support in planning over the weeks that are coming, please just reach out to your MEMA regional office, and we will make sure you get that support. So again, thank you for being with us today.